What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I just woke up a little bit ago, and I'm using my voice. I'm making it an octave or two higher because you wouldn't be able to handle my voice as it exists right now. It'd be very deep, so most all of you would just fall apart. You can't handle it. So having said that, we need to talk about Thor 4 because there are things we need to talk about from this movie because I still don't care about Gorr's head, tails, and nose. That still doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is all the stuff that does matter, which is how they handled the character, which was kind of okay. So, let's get into the Easter eggs, right? Let's get into the little Easter eggs, references, all the stuff you missed, because there's a lot of stuff you missed. And in fact, we'll address one of the great big huge things that a lot of fans are pissed off about right now. I wouldn't even say pissed off about, that a lot of fans are just kind of like, okay, this is getting a little out of hand, right? Well, we will address that as we get closer to the end of the video because it's kind of a big deal, right? So, first things first, right? Gorr, that's the guy we got to talk about. That we get this depiction of Gorr basically carrying his child on a desolate planet, which of course is in reference to the comics. So those guys who don't know the deal about that, literally Thor lived on a world where it was just harsh and desolate and really, really crappy, pretty much exactly what you saw in the movie. And he essentially lost his family over time due to the desolate nature of that world. Imagine living in the Sahara Desert, and that's like your whole planet, right? Tatooine from Star Wars. And so because of that, like losing everything and the fact that gods never answered their prayers, in the comics, Gorr started taking revenge of the gods because once he realized they existed, he realized they simply just didn't care. And so that's one of the cool things that we saw is that in this movie, right, the black armor guy basically bears this incredibly striking resemblance to Knull, the symbiote god. But it's kind of insane, right? The idea of Knull being, or at least existing, and this is kind of confirming it, but not really, because we don't know exactly what direction they're gonna go in, right? In the comics right now, that was Knull, the symbiote god, that fell in that battle with the army of golden gods, and then basically ended up, you know, having his Necro sword picked up by Gorr, right? That's how that was in the comics. When Gorr originally appeared in the comics, that was not the case because Knull had not been created yet. He didn't exist, quote unquote, in terms of like Donny Cates creating his character and all that kind of stuff. It hadn't happened yet, right? So it's one of those things where they could go either way. The fact that that is, in effect, the story of Knull to a degree, and even the Celestials in Omnipotence City, which we'll talk about here in a minute, because there's a ton of evidence in this movie that points to the idea that that is, in fact, Knull, the symbiote god. This looks like that may very well be the direction they're going in. And if it is Knull, the symbiote god, man, it's gonna be insane because Knull, man, there is a point in the story, right? The King in Black, which we covered over at Comics Explained. There's a point where Knull like when he finally shows up to Earth, nobody on Earth ever had a chance. Like none of the superheroes ever had a chance. Like it was absolutely crazy. We'll talk about that later, right? We gotta stay on track. I'm doing my best to stay on track. We gotta do that, right? So the powers of the Necro sword, right? It's basically the ability to summon like the shadow beasts and so on that are very, very alien in terms of how they look. And again, this is likely a reference to the fact that Knull is the god of the symbiotes because they look kind of alien, but they also look very symbiote-y, right? Is that a word? Symbiote? Symbiotic? They look like symbiotes in a lot of ways, right? That's the cool thing here, is because what we get is this idea that Knull, the symbiote god, really does have a hand here, because those shadow monsters, that's the living abyss. Again, like we'll talk more about that because I feel like there's this huge moment, right? The shadow realm and all that kind of stuff, right? That whole thing where it's like that's where the sword comes from. But the thing about this is we switch over, right? You get like this whole like stage play. Now this is likely just a callback to Ragnarok. I don't know why it wouldn't be, right? Thor's a nod to like Dr. Donald Blake, right? He literally uses his umbrella, slams it on the ground, and then they do like the transformations. Like, you know what I mean? That's a reference to like the old Thor comics. Those of you guys who don't know, back in the day when Thor first came into existence, what you had, or at least was first introduced to us as the reader, what you had was Donald Blake, who was by all standards of measurement a coward. And there's like literally an alien invasion in just this little small segment of the world where he's hanging out with Jane Foster and he just runs away because he's a coward. And he ends up in a cave, or he's trapped in this cave, and there's just like a stick that's literally just sitting on this rock. and he gets frustrated and he hits the stick on the ground, or maybe he hits it on the cave wall, I can't remember, it's one of those two, and it turns into Mjolnir, and it turns him into Thor. And that's the way that worked for years in Marvel Comics, right? The superhero alter ego identity, that was still widely popular in the 60s, stopped being popular in the mid-70s, was totally gone by the time he got into the 80s, and that was basically it. But for years in Marvel Comics, Donald Blake would hit his walking stick on the ground, and he would turn into Thor, right? And the stick would turn into Mjolnir. So this was a really, really cool reference. I absolutely love that, especially like as an old school comic book fan. Infinity Cones. Let's talk about Infinity Cones, the ice cream shop. Let's be honest, guys. We would all go there. Every single one of us would go there. And in fact, like I remember sitting in the theater and people were just like there were people who were commenting like, dude, I wish that place existed. I do. I know you do. Like we all kind of do. And we would go there, right? Like Infinity Cones, an Infinity Gauntlet themed ice cream restaurant, right? Just named after Thanos. I thought it was a great little funny moment and that kind of a thing. Of course, we also get the return of the old cast, right? Dr. Selvig and Darcy and Jane and Lady Sif and all that. It is cool to see that. And I'm gonna be honest with you guys, you know, even now, I get that Thor is going more in the direction of like the comedic story, which is fine, right? I don't necessarily have a problem with comedic Thor. I think it's kind of wearing out its welcome, to be honest. Like I kind of miss like the old school serious Thor. I do like that they address all the reasons why Thor is just so comedic now, right? As opposed to being like, you know, hyper serious and that kind of a thing. And in fact, there's a great juxtaposition that takes place between Zeus and Thor that we'll talk about later. But one of the big things is I do kind of miss that sort of nostalgia, right? That old school Thor movie. Now, a lot of that I think is really less about the serious nature of Thor and more about just like the first 10 years when we were being introduced to all these characters for the first time, but I do kind of miss that to a degree. So it was cool to see everybody, right? It's like the gang's back together again. You know what I mean? Like it was a nice bit of nostalgia that we got over the course of the film. Now, of course, we also get the line by Odin's Raven. That, of course, was a line said by Will Ferrell in Anchorman. There was also by the Beard of Zeus, which was kind of crazy. Jane, of course, has stage 4 cancer, which is a direct comic reference, but it's actually also bigger than that. It's a main focal point of her character. We also did a video over at Comics Explained called Jane Foster Explained, which, if you're interested, will basically make you an expert on the character. But the big caveat is that when Jane Foster was made Thor in Marvel Comics, Jason Aaron quite literally put the kibosh on it, right? And this idea that people were like, well, she's going to be around forever and she's going to replace, you know, Thor, Odin's son, forever and ever and ever. No, he put the kibosh on that fast and was like, no. She's not going to be Thor forever. We're not replacing Thor, Odin's son. And if you really believe that's the case, you don't know anything about comics, which is a true statement. So the thing about that is when she had cancer, the way it worked is she would undergo chemotherapy, but every time she turned into Thor, it would wipe the chemotherapy out of her system. So she would always be reset, but her cancer would continue to progress. So it was basically Jason Aaron's way of saying she's going to die. And she did. In the comics, she basically died and then became Valkyrie, is really how that worked. Now, the cool thing here is that, of course, you also get Thor's helmet, and his general outfit is really a reference to his Thor comic book outfit, which actually debuted in Thor number 378 back in the day. So that's a cool little thing. Omnipotence City is visited, where we basically get like all the gods that are part of Marvel's Skyfathers, which I loved. I thought that was a great thing, and I've been wondering for a long time, when are we going to get Skyfathers? In hindsight, I think it makes more sense that they introduce them with Omnipotence City than without Omnipotence City. And the reason why is because if you look at the nature of the Skyfathers in Marvel Comics, when you got Jason Aaron's run on Thor, which this whole movie was basically Jason Aaron's run on Thor, just different aspects of it used in different ways or sometimes reworked. But the thing about this is that he introduced Omnipotence City as a place where quite literally all the gods can meet, right? So you got like the huge Omnipotence library and all that kind of stuff, where it's like every god who's ever existed and everything they've ever done, like all that cool stuff, right? Now, the thing here is that when the Skyfathers were basically rolled over into that, what it did is it created cohesion and it created organization to a group that previously didn't have it. All you really had in Marvel Comics was like the Skyfathers, basically the leader of the earthly pantheon of gods. And like they meet up sometimes and do stuff, they get their nails done, talk about their feelings, they're modern men. But beyond that, like we don't really have any organization or structure in terms of how they work. I love the idea of Omnipotence City throwing it in there and then basically saying, this is where all the gods meet. I love that idea, right? Where the gods all dwell and they all have their own location and that kind of a thing. I love that whole concept, right? So following that, of course, we get these various gods over the course of the movie, some of whom Gorr fought, some of whom we simply just saw. But the god of dumplings is basically a reference to that like kawaii anime aesthetic, which is really interesting to see. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Very terrible when it comes to pronouncing like Japanese names or words, different things like that. But then you also had like the Game of Thrones god, who was basically made of scissors. Right now, one of the cool things that happened in Omnipotence City, and this is a really cool moment that I'm sure pissed off all the people that hate Jane Foster, but you know what? The sun rose and the day went on and you're okay. So relax, bro. Take a chill pill. So basically, Jane Foster is given the title of Thor by Thor in Omnipotence City. Now, it didn't exactly happen that way in the comics, but it's still the concept being carried over from the comics. That what you had was, in a lot of ways, Thor, like when Jane Foster officially took Mjolnir and then became Thor, what you had was a subsection of the comic book fandom who was like, no, we want Thor to reject her because we reject her. We don't want her to be Thor, so we don't want Thor to want her to be Thor. And Jason Aaron was like, tough shit. So basically you had this moment in the comic where literally Odin's son is like, you can be Thor. And it pissed off all the people that hated Jane Foster. It was kind of funny. Honestly, I don't normally do this, but I was just basking in their tears. I was loving their tears. It was just like, yes, your tears taste delicious. I absolutely loved it because I loved the character and I loved to see that basically Marvel was willing to take a risk with changing the entire landscape of Thor, even if only temporarily. But after a while, you just get bored of reading the same thing all the time. And so the way I always kind of saw it was you had fans who were like, yeah, this is cool, I want to see where this goes. And then you had other fans who wanted to just drag things down to boredom and the way they had always been because they didn't want to leave their comfort zone. So I loved the fact that they had changed things up, and I love the character of Jane. But beyond that, you got Celestials in Omnipotence City, as well as having statues of themselves in the Hall of Eternity. Now, this led to a lot of people asking the question, why did we see any of the Celestials in Omnipotence City? And unless I missed something, this was not a question that was readily answered. But I think the answer to that question is because of Knull, and it's because of Gorr, right? That Gorr and Knull are linked in that way. And in fact, we'll talk about that more once you get to literally that whole black and white realm. But one of the things to know is that when it came to Knull, the symbiote god, the Celestials were well aware of him. They were, and in fact, the reason why the Celestials knew of Knull is because they fought in the distant past, in the early days of the universe, that when the Celestials, quote unquote, moved in and started creating life and so on, it pissed off Knull because he was basically in this realm of just darkness, right? He loved living in the realm of darkness, right? He sat around all day smoking cigarettes, listening to The Cure. I don't know, but he was just emo, right? He was just misunderstood by the world. And here come the Celestials with happiness, and they pissed him off. But in all reality, they were creating life and they were creating light in a world or in a space that was all darkness. And so what this did is it led to Knull going to war against the Celestials. He successfully killed one. And then when that happened, the Celestials banished him back to his own dimension, and then ultimately he ended up escaping again, which led to him going across the cosmos, killing all the gods he could find, because his argument was, if I cannot readily defeat the Celestials head on, I'll destroy everything they're building, and then when there's nothing left, then I'll take them on, because literally I will kill all the gods and absorb their energy into myself. So basically the actions of Gorr before Gorr. It's one of the reasons why in the comics, when Gorr got the Necro sword, that Knull stood hands off and just let Gorr continue on his journey. Literally they cover that in King in Black, because it's the question we had. Why didn't Knull step in and take his sword back from Gorr when Gorr used it? And the answer of Knull is he was basically completing my whole quest without me. So why would I kill this speck of an alien on some world somewhere and take my sword back? Because let's be honest with ourselves, Knull could have absolutely crushed Gorr with the greatest of ease. It would not have been a contest at all. But that's why the Celestials, I think, in this particular scene, they're aware of Knull, right? At some previous point in time in the universe's history, they fought. And like, they know who Knull is. We know that like Marvel and Sony are working on a joint project with Knull the symbiote god. So it makes perfect sense that we would basically see the Celestials on alert and just be like, okay, so like somebody's got to do something about Gorr, because if they don't, he's gonna either become the next Knull or he's gonna wake up Knull. And if he wakes up Knull, well then we're all screwed. Because if you thought Thanos was bad, he's the least of our concerns. So, having said that, the character of Zeus was interesting. I didn't necessarily have a problem with Zeus, and in fact, I loved the way he was depicted, because I felt like he was a great juxtaposition to the way that Thor used to be. Right? If you guys notice that, I don't know how many of you guys noticed that, but he was a reflection of Thor's past, right? Arrogant, full of hubris, his former idol, all that kind of stuff. Like, it was one of those things where in a lot of ways, Thor had looked up to Zeus, but Zeus was reminiscent of the person Thor used to be, and it's not who he is anymore. And so in a lot of ways, I mean, Zeus is cool. Obviously, there's a big post-credit moment that focuses with him, or at least that offers an expansion with the character of Zeus and the rest of the Olympian mythos. But what matters there is I felt like Zeus was in a lot of ways thrown in here to give us an illustration of how much different Thor is now than he used to be, how much he's changed. Now, I think that's readily obvious to us, but I don't think it was readily obvious to Thor. And so that, I think, is one of the coolest moments that came from the whole film. Now, of course, Thor's back tattoo is indeed Loki horns, so that's awesome. But the Necro sword also has its own realm called the Shadow Realm, right? Now, at this point, this is where I think things got really, really cool, because in its own realm, the Shadow Realm, I think that is the realm of Knull the symbiote god, right? That's where like the living abyss and all that kind of stuff comes from. That's literally him. Like, that's where the sword was created, or where the sword has existed. That's where it originated, so on and so forth. It all comes from Knull. At the same time, right, the monochrome world, the black and white world, as I like to refer to it as, right, that this is basically a place where the only things with color are the things that radiate with godly powers, right? Like the glow of weapons, and more importantly here, I don't know how many of you guys noticed, more importantly here, Gorr's eyes. And what I think this means is not that Gorr is a god, but that Gorr is channeling the power of a god, which is the Necro sword, the sword of Knull, the symbiote god, right? And I think that is because Gorr is basically, no, I wouldn't say absorbing the power of Knull, but channeling the power of Knull, the power of a being greater than himself. That's what I think is going on. And if there's anything in this movie that I think solidifies the existence of Knull the symbiote god, I think it's that. I think it's that particular moment here. Now, this is why I say I think what Thor 4 is in a lot of ways like the Empire Strikes Back. Like Phase 4 in general is kind of the Empire Strikes Back of the MCU. I mean, obviously Thor 4 is not like I'm not saying like it's as good as Empire Strikes Back, right? I mean, I'm sure some Star Wars fan out there is gonna be like, wait, are you saying that Thor 4 is as good as Empire Strikes Back? Because, bro, that's not true. No, like that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying here is that Empire Strikes Back was the movie that established and built the Star Wars universe as it existed at the time. It was an informational film. And that's what I think most of what's going on with Phase 4 in the MCU is, specifically with Thor 4. I think that Thor 4, I think Doctor Strange 2, Loki, this is all stuff where they're world building. And I think that's really what's going on here, because what you get, right, that like as we because at this point, of course, we're basically doing this in chronological order of the film, right? The hammer visiting Jane Foster, wanting to be used in reference to her final time using the hammer, that was in the original comic book run, right? It wanted to be used one last time. The Jane Foster renouncing the name of Lady Thor and wanting to be called Mighty Thor is a reference to her actual title in the comics. That Thor can share his powers like Shazam does, and he does it in this movie, which is an interesting concept. But you basically get this godly world-building thing, that they fast-tracked this idea of Jane Foster, like she's not gonna make it, right? What you also got is you got the Hall of Eternity that has statues of Erishim, the Watcher, the Living Tribunal, and what appear to be several other cosmic entities. And that Eternity is a physical cosmic being in the MCU, and is in another dimension or another plane of existence, I guess. Now, this is why this is so important, right? That one, what this shows is that we basically have awareness of all these cosmic beings who exist out there. How far-reaching that goes, we're not entirely sure. Are there other places like this that have other statues of other godly beings? Probably not. But the thing here is that by introducing Eternity the way that they did, which is essentially a wishing machine, I would argue that's the dimension of manifestations. That's basically what that is. I don't know if it actually is, but it looks like it is. So I think we've talked about this before here. I can't remember. I don't really know. But the important thing is that for those of you guys who don't know, the Dimension of Manifestations is a place in Marvel Comics. It was established in the old Quasar comics back in 1992, I think it was. And the whole idea behind this is that the cosmic entities, as they appear in the comics, that's not their true form. That when they do appear, the way they show up is a result of an M-body. So literally, they go to the Dimension of Manifestations, a being called Anthropomorpho gives them an M-body, and then they show up in the main universe. Because they are, in effect, concepts. Right? Despite how powerful they are, they just represent ideologies, right? It's like having a conversation with the fact that you're hungry. It's not necessarily something you can do. It's more of a feeling that you have or a concept that you know exists out there. But when the cosmic entities end up taking on an M-body, that's when you can physically see them. Now, one of the other cool things here is that scene in the movie when you saw Eternity in what looked like gold on one side and black on the other, that was a reference to the amalgamation Eternity, which is to say when Eternity and Infinity merged together in a singular being. It was not a one-for-one copy from the comics, but that's basically what it was, because Eternity is basically this guy who looks like a walking, talking universe, right? You have stars and galaxies inside of him and all that kind of stuff. Infinity is literally just like gold and black, right? So it's really like they very much look like an amalgamation between the two. But the thing about this is that we're getting more and more references to cosmic entities. We're getting more and more references to the living tribunal and so on and so forth. We're slowly building up to it. And I think, as I kind of look at that, I think it makes the most sense. Because if in like Doctor Strange 2, they had just sprung the living tribunal on everybody, people wouldn't have been able to handle it. The average moviegoer would not have really been able to they would have been like, okay, this is kind of weird, right? Plus, when it comes to the different cosmic entities, you literally have a hierarchy there, right? You have like some that are powerful and then some that are more powerful and some that are the most powerful, right? Like, for example, you do have Eternity. There's a multiversal Eternity. There is a manifestation of the multiverse, that version of Eternity, right? The physical form of the multiverse. Now, it's one of those weird things because having a multiversal Eternity doesn't seem to make sense in the face of the living tribunal, because the living tribunal is the multiverse given form. So how you square that circle, I'm not entirely sure. Basically, I don't know, like two stories, both different sides of the same coin, whatever, who cares? The thing about this is there's a hierarchy of power there. And I think that by introducing Eternity before we actually see the living tribunal as an actual being, I think is important. I think is a significant thing because it shows us the place these different beings serve. Because one of the things to remember is that Eternity was referenced, like Eternity, Death, Oblivion, Infinity, I think, they were referenced in like the old school like the first Guardians of the Galaxy film, right? Remember like that whole artwork behind the scenes, that kind of thing, where like James Gunn and them were talking about like the cosmic entities, where the Infinity Stones came from and all that kind of stuff. Like they reference those cosmic entities. So like we know that like they've been toying with this idea for years. They've just been trying to figure out how it is they're going to make it work. And it's cool to see that they chose this form to do it with. So I do love the cosmic entity idea, right? The whole thing about Eternity. Now, the thing about this, and this is the caveat, and this is what I think has a lot of people bothered, right? Eternity is basically a wishing machine. And so that also means that a lot of people who have died in the MCU can be brought back. And in fact, death itself is effectively meaningless, in that basically it's shown that bringing someone back from the dead can be as simple as making a visit to Eternity. Now, there are a couple of caveats here. For example, we saw a person brought back. I don't think it was established that Eternity could bring back an infinite number of people for an extended period of time. But that's the big question that a lot of people are asking. And that's kind of the big caveat. A lot of people are saying, okay, so wait a minute, you're telling me that Thor's always known about Eternity, which is basically a wishing machine. He's a cosmic cube, essentially, right? That's what cosmic cubes were in the comics. They were wishing boxes. So you're telling me that here, right, Eternity is a being who's basically a wishing machine. If you discover it with the key, which turns out to be Stormbreaker, and you can unlock that and you can get to Eternity, you can wish for anything. So people are asking, why didn't Thor just wish back all the people who were snapped out by Thanos? Or why didn't they just wish Thanos out of existence, right? Or why didn't they use that? Right? Why didn't they use Eternity? And what a lot of people are seeing this as, and honestly, I think it's a legitimate beef, that I think that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is really going to run into problems with this if they're not careful. People are starting to see it as this ongoing use of MacGuffins. That what you have here are writers and directors who are creating stories and they don't know how to end them. And so what they're doing is just quite literally pulling random stuff out of their ass and then just saying, well, what if Gorr goes to Eternity? and just wishes his daughter back, and then not giving any real thought to the question, in the greater scheme of everything that's happened in the MCU, how is this going to affect it? Because now people are literally asking these questions like, why did they do that before? Why didn't Thor do that before? Why did the Avengers go through all that shit when all Thor had to do is say, hey, wait a minute, guys, everybody relax, everybody chill. I know things are pretty bad, but here's the thing. So out in the dimension of manifestations, right, there's this dude that just sits around all day long, doing literally nothing. And it's really a statue more than anything else that basically looks like the universe. And because I have Stormbreaker now, we can just go there and just wish for everything to be undone and for everything to go back to the way it was before. We can just wish for that. I mean, you guys want to do that? Right? I feel like they all look around and Captain America would be like, yeah, man, let's do that. Because trying to figure out time travel and then going back into the past and taking the Infinity Stones out of particular locations and how to make sure we put them back in the exact locations and all that stuff kind of seems a little bit unnecessary if all we have to do is just go to that guy and ask him to fix everything. Right? Like I totally understand where people are coming from. And this use of MacGuffins in a lot of ways just kind of seems to be getting out of hand. I wouldn't say that like Taika Waititi and those guys are lazy writers and lazy directors, but what I am saying is the use of MacGuffins in the MCU kind of feels like it's getting to that point. And so I certainly see where a lot of people are just sort of like this, like something needs to be done about this. Now, what it also does here though, is it does introduce some interesting possibilities. For example, Gorr's daughter with her like reflection and everything could potentially be the universe's stand-in for Captain Universe or possibly even Cubic. And the reason why is because when she comes back, she's got that whole godly type look. Right, like that whole like looking like the reflection of the universe, eternity, that kind of a thing. And so for a while, I've suspected that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is going to try to find a way to introduce Captain Universe. And the nature of Captain Universe is that it was a being that was designed to safeguard the universe from various threats that exist out there. And that with Gorr having done everything he's done, and if we look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe Phase 4 and Thor 4 as a world-building film, how far of outside the realm of possibility do you think it is that Gorr's actions woke up Knull? And that if it's true, Knull is on his way here. And if that's the case, Eternity would be aware of it. And at the very least, we don't know it's anything behind its motivations or anything like that, that it basically turns the daughter of Gorr into Captain Universe. And she just goes forward from there. I don't really think she'd be like a Cubic. For those of you guys who don't know, Cubic was basically a sentient cosmic cube. Well, there were a couple of them. There was Cobic way back in the day. Then there's Cubic, which is the more recent one. And I don't really think that's the case. I don't think we're getting like the daughter of Thor of Gorr coming back as what's effectively a cosmic cube, channeling the energy of the Beyondverse, right, or the energy of eternity, or something along those lines. I think it's more reasonable she would be a Captain Universe type character. I think that'd be awesome if that was the case. Don't necessarily know if it is. But the other thing about this is that Zeus saying that the gods are a joke, of course, is likely a reference to this film, at least this film series of Thor becoming more successful when they started leaning into more of the jokey style. But again, I feel like it's kind of wearing out. I think it's kind of wearing a little thin. People are like, okay, look, I mean, Thor being funny was great for like a movie or so, but like we kind of want serious Thor back, right? I don't know if we're gonna get that again. You know, I'm sort of split. I like the comedy element, but I also kind of miss the serious element. Right now, here's one of the other cool things too here, is that Valhalla is a real place that actually exists, which makes sense given the nature of the Thor mythos, and like Omnipotence City and all those places actually exist. But that basically means that the death of almost any Asgardian god, and really any god in general, could be made meaningless, and that Marvel will probably use this fact, at least at some point, to shake up things by bringing certain characters back to life. So that's cool. I love the idea of Valhalla. Now, what this means is that likely Jane Foster will go on there. They may bring her back as some variation of Thor later on. I wouldn't be surprised if Valkyrie, as she exists in the MCU, will end up becoming Jane Foster. I mean, we know that Valkyrie is alive, right? Like she and Sif and them are like training the kids in Asgard and so on and so forth. So Jane Foster's kind of out of it. The only reason I even go with this is because, again, that's what happened to Jane Foster in the comics, that once she died and passed on, that she went into Valhalla and then became a Valkyrie. And so that's really where she's been ever since. And in fact, she has her own comic book run called Valkyrie, which isn't terrible. It's kind of cool, actually, to be honest with you guys. But with that being said, guys, that's everything we spotted, right? Let us know all the things that we may have missed down in the comment section. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.